I didn't plan anything. I did not plan my life, and I did not know that I would wind up writing. In fact, I had no idea I was going to write a book. I didn't know I could write a book. I ended up doing it just to see if I could do it. So there was no clear plan. All the jobs that I had were probably because I don't like, this will sound like an eccentric answer, but there's truth to it. I don't like going through an involved bureaucratic application process. And the jobs I had were easy to get. I would go up to a guy and say, "Do you need help unloading that truck?" And that's how I got my jobs. Somebody would say, "Sure, help me unload the truck," and then I'd work hard, and maybe he would have me come back the next day. So that's got a lot to do with the work history that I had up until the time that I wrote the book. And it's funny you should say that, because I think on deep down, I felt that way too. I never said that to anyone before, but I guess the book was the beginning of a new life for me, and I just never said that to anyone. You said it for me. Well, I first of all, I saw this phrase outside of a religious school in Brooklyn called the Al-Noor School. I have just learned that Al-Noor means the light in Arabic. Beautiful name. And when I say it's a religious school, I think you could compare it to a Catholic school or something like that. It's a school for young people through high school. I assume they have a pretty standard curriculum, but there must also be some religious instruction. And there was a kind of legend underneath the name Al-Noor School that said preparation for the next life. Later, that phrase has changed to preparation for education for this life and the hereafter. And then finally, it was removed completely, perhaps because it sounded too Islamic or something, and the people who ran the school wanted to show assimilation and to reduce that Islamic character in their sign. Anyway, it just looked like the right title for the book because Skinner, my hero, is coming back from the war. He's facing a new life as a civilian, and Zolé, of course, is attempting a new life as an immigrant in the United States. Beyond that, though, I think I had in mind a kind of Siberian religion, a shaman spiritualism, like one of those old Indian religions. That was in the background of that title for me. If I'm not mistaken, among bandits and wolves.
Yeah.
And it is a direct reference to the fairy tales that Zolé hears at the beginning of the book. Which I was influenced by, which I recalled reading as a kid. I love folk tales, I love myths, I grew up reading them, and my favorites were Russian, Irish, and American Indian. Those are my favorites. I think about American Indian folktales all the time. Actually, this wasn't really by design. I think you write the book you can write. And, I was a beginner going into this. And by the way, I still feel a lot like a beginner. I'm struggling to write a second book right now. I look forward to becoming an expert at writing someday. So that'll be a life's work. But anyway, I wrote the book I thought I could write. And I began by, you asked me about influences, I began by being very influenced by Hemingway. So influenced that I found myself doing a bad impression of Hemingway. I was channeling Hemingway's voice. And I started reading what I had written and going, oh, this is like Hemingway, only worse. So I decided to stop trying to be anyone else and just listen to my own voice. After a while, I found I could hear myself a little bit better. One of the neat things about the place where the novel is set in Queens is you can overhear pretty neat stuff. And sometimes I would hear people say things that were far more interesting than I could have made up. I heard great conversations, and some, it's just material you want to use if you can. I've been giving a stock answer of 5 years. I mean, that's as good of an answer as I could probably give. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I guess the seeds in your imagination do go back a really long time. I don't think I sat down and tried to really to start writing a book. I don't think I turned to my wife and said, "Hey, honey, I'm going to try to write a novel." I think I did that I think there was about a 5-year span between when I said that and when I got the thing done. So I'll I think what really took me so long wasn't doing research exactly. It was just the trial and error of writing the book. I mean, I kind of compare it to a dog going down blind alleys and coming back. And you're sniffing for the story, and that's not it. You got to go back to the main trail and try sniffing again. And that's what I felt like. I mean, I spent a long time I'd sit there for 5 hours at the local coffee shop, and I would write and write and write and write, and I just know it wasn't any good. I just know I was going the wrong direction, and I don't know why it is that way. I wish I could control the process better. I bet every writer wishes they had a quicker blow to the head that they could use, but it just doesn't happen that fast. So it was just running back and forth, trial and error until I got what I wanted. And that's really why it took so long. That's pretty good. You know what? I'm gonna remember that, because I'm always trying to come up with something really short that I can remember. Like, you've got to remember these things, and then a week later I go, well, it's not those three. And I guess I agree with that. I mean, what I would say is, I think it's disturbing to imagine that America is becoming an empire. But I think that horse has already run out of the barn. I mean, I guess we are an empire. And when you have an empire, you have a certain amount of brutal force. And that force from the state is exhibited in two main ways that I can think of. One is by attacking, through the military, by going to war with other countries and taking their territory. And I think the other way is by imprisoning people at home. So the prison system and the military system are two aspects of brutal government authority, and I think I was reacting to that, because I wrote this book as a reaction to the Iraq War, which I just felt before I knew anything about it, it just felt wrong to me. I mean, I'm not against war in principle. I'm not against violence in principle. There are some people who will only respond to force. And it would be foolish to say we should put all our guns down or not hire the police, send the police home and say we don't, we want to be pacifists. I mean, on the other hand, I don't think it makes sense to have a war that you don't absolutely have to have, primarily because innocent people will die. It's one thing for a young American to decide, hey, I feel so passionately about September 11th that I'm willing to sacrifice myself. But there are a lot of people who didn't ask to be sacrificed, and that's highly disturbing. I don't hold it against the young American. They're not a policymaker. They're a 17-year-old. I do hold it against our electorate and our politicians, most especially, the Cheneys, the Bushes, the Wolfowitzes, the neoconservatives who forced us into Iraq. So that was one thing that disturbed me greatly, and the other was, of course, the Patriot Act and the idea that there were dragnet. That people were being scooped up in a dragnet and imprisoned on immigration violations, when a lot of them may have just been, it would have just seemed wrong. They might have been working in the United States for 15 years, and the idea of families being torn apart that way and innocent people being imprisoned. And in the climate of post 9/11 America, there were very disturbing stories about prison guards molesting, abusing detainees on the theory that this could be payback, that they deserved it because their sympathies were with Al Qaeda or something. So those were the two main things that distressed me, and they pushed me to write the book. In fact, she's an outsider, really, not just in the United States. Yeah. She's a real individual, and to me, that's her appeal. That's what I love about her. I think Chinese society is very conventional to a degree. There's a parallel between China and the United States. In some ways, the United States is like China, an empire, and there's a lot about American life that is pretty conventional. I mean, we have a big bureaucracy. If you work in an office, you're very conscious of control, and I think there's some argument for saying that corporations are running more of our lives than maybe they should be. There's disturbing reports that corporations really kind of write the laws that we have. I'm not an expert in any of those things, but I have a sense of them. And I like the idea of somebody who's like, kind of a cowboy who doesn't want to play by that set of rules, who, is just saying, don't fence me in. And that's what I saw with Zole. So she's an outsider, just as you say. And Skinner, the way I see him as an outsider, is maybe a little bit different, because I sort of set out to imagine him as a pretty ordinary guy, not a guy who had problems relating to his peers, just kind of a regular high school kid who went to the war and was perfectly well integrated into his unit to begin with. I think where he becomes an outsider is really the fate of a lot of military personnel who have difficulty reintegrating into civilian life after being at war. So that was the way in which he was from the outside. Anybody who comes back from war may feel like civilian life is unrecognizable to them, possibly. I can't speak for them, but that was the sense that I got, because there's a lot of war literature out there, and that sure comes across. Absolutely. There were two main influences that helped me to see the situation we're talking about, which is that life for Chinese people isn't, we're all Chinese. It's kind of tribal. It's there are factions and cliques. Where I think that came across was from a book called The Snakehead, which is a great piece of journalism by Patrick Radden Keefe. He writes for The New Yorker. And in the early stages of me trying to write my book, I stumbled across The Snakehead. And it describes the human smuggling operations from the south of China, from the province of Fujian, to the East Broadway section of Chinatown in New York City. And a snakehead is a smuggler of people. And anyway, with that, one of the main things I learned from that book was that the new arrivals who had been smuggled in, the Fujianese, were not welcomed by the original inhabitants of Chinatown, the Cantonese, who had immigrated legally by and large, whereas the Fujianese had immigrated illegally, in a larger percentage of them had. So that kind of made me think of, within the Chinese, you have these different groups who look down on each other and who compete, and so the Chinese are also further divided by their language. If you now, this I also know from personal experience because I spent a year in China, and we were told that the local dialect would be different in a village that was just a short distance away from us. And in fact, the standard Chinese dialect that I speak, that I learned, Mandarin, was different from the dialect right on the street where I lived, which was the town of Huanggang. And they spoke, I guess they called it Huanggang Hua or Huangzhou Hua. I think they called it Huanggang Hua. So, so like, for example, if you wanted to say, I want to get off the bus, in Mandarin, I'd say, 下车, and in Huanggang Hua, they would say 有哈地, which means literally there is someone who wishes to get off. So it's actually different grammatically, and there's a different pronunciation. That kind of stuff fascinated me, and so that was the world I described for her. For one thing, I saw two people who were just highly attracted to each other. Yeah. I think love stories usually begin as sex stories, and there is heat between these two people. That was the first thing that I saw. I also imagined they're based on the characters that they are, based on the people they are. I saw Zolé being involved in a certain type of courtship where she would roughhouse with Skinner. She would, punch him around a little bit, and he'd sort of grapple with her and try to make contact physically, and she wouldn't allow it. So the first thing that I saw in my mind was a courtship between the two of them, and yes, after they become intimate, there's a period of sort of a happy time. It seems hopeful. I thought that was the key, because dramatically, you want to take the reader on a journey where, well, yes, ultimately something is lost, but to feel the loss, you have to know that there is something to lose. So it was very important to me to show that things are up before they're down. And that was the role that love played. It played a dramatic role in climbing this hill of hope in the middle of the book. Well, there's nothing I love more as a reader than this menacing feeling that something bad is going to happen. And I have to give my respects to an American author who probably doesn't get the airplay that he deserves. His name is Eugene Martin, and he was also published by John Carlo, my publisher, and I had the privilege of reading his writing before I wrote my book, and it made me very excited about this very thing that we're talking about, because he kind of lights a fuse and it burns, and you just know that something. You have a sense of menace. Well, I think that's terrific. That's a crackle. I like that. So I did my best to try to do that, to create that effect as well. Well, I'll tell you exactly what I was trying to do. I had an image of the end of the book, and I really wrote the book towards that final cataclysm. So, and I don't know what you call that. I think, if anything, maybe in a way you kind of call it a crime story. That was how I really imagined it. I imagined it as a news article that you would read involving, a veteran and some other people. And that was really where I got the book from. I looked at that final event, and then I've said this before when people have asked me this. I wound the tape back in my head to imagine the starting point, and that was how I got there. So I didn't think in terms of the category, I'm going to write a love story or a war story or something. I realized that those would be elements, but the story I was writing, I think I thought of it as a news story. A lot of people read the book who aren't from New York, or they're not from Queens, and they focus on the fact that this book doesn't take place in Manhattan, and they sort of equate New York City with Manhattan. Maybe I don't feel like I belong in New York, and maybe that comes through a little bit. I think, when I moved there myself, I always said I was just passing through. I don't plan to stay there. It's not home. I used to live on the West Coast. I think Zola is probably influenced there by me, by my desire to get out of the city, and that this isn't the final place she's going to stop. And also, it's personal taste as an audience member. How in plays sometimes, I've seen a couple plays, not many, but everything takes place in that one stage. Yeah. It feels a little claustrophobic. And what I like is when whatever you're reading or watching moves you around to different settings, because really the world is interesting. A lot of New Yorkers like to say that New York is the center of the universe, and I'm sorry, it's not. Everywhere you are is the center of the universe. There's a lot of centers. So it's not, you don't understand life until you move around, and you don't understand people until you move everywhere. And so that's why I wanted to keep moving, and I wanted to keep her perspective moving. Well, I guess, it's a dark story. I think a lot of people have read it and said that it is a critique of America. I'm not surprised that people see that. On the other hand, I'm not an expert in my own country. I just really put a story together from things that I saw, and I would feel a little funny and out of my depth if I was to sit here and say that the American dream is dead, or to speak for other people. I really don't know all that, and I don't think it's as simple as all that. I think there are many positive things that are happening too, and but you're right. The story is a little sobering, and I think it is just a reflection of my state of mind. What I was seeing at that particular time. If you're asking me, is this representative of everybody's life in America? I can't really speak to that. I guess it kind of.
It's not my question.
Yeah, it's true for them, and the reason the story's that way is because I know there are some people who are in that kind of predicament. In particular, if you look at Zola, she's a classic example of somebody. I hate to put it this way, but she's killable. If you were a criminal, you couldn't pick a better victim than her. And she doesn't have an official identity. She's her vulnerability is on purpose, because both for me and the reader, I hope, it creates a sense of anxiety. Maybe it was. I don't know. I to tell you the truth, I don't know exactly all the things I was thinking. I mean, there's probably psychological reasons why this particular story appealed to me. I didn't say I'm going to give a voice to Zola, for example. I didn't, or to somebody who's like Zola, to an illegal immigrant. But now that you mention it, I do like the idea of it. I go to a movie and I see actors who are obviously actors. Walk down the street and I'll see 15 people who I'd rather see in the movies. And I go, well, why not them? They look more interesting. They have interesting lives. They've done interesting things. I mean, those are the people I'd like to see a story about. So that's really why I wound up with people like Zola and Skinner. I don't think I was thinking give them a voice. I was thinking put the camera on them. That's what I was really thinking.